Science fiction bridges the gap between speculative fiction and scientific fact. Science fiction creates a language for people. It plants ideas and provides a launching point for the imagination. It is used to describe concepts and stories that evidence cannot currently support. Without science fiction, this language would have never been deployed, and its impacts would have never manifested. This is why it is important to acknowledge the people who propelled the sci-fi genre. Mary Shelley, contributing to her novel Frankenstein, is considered to be the first instance of science fiction. Mary Shelley is now seen as the mother of science fiction, better known as sci-fi. Mary Shelley had many possible pieces of inspiration for writing Frankenstein, but one piece stands out. On January 17, 1803, at Newgate Prison in London, a young man named George Forster was hung for murder. After the execution, his body was going to be carried ceremoniously through the streets, a common practice for the time. However, other plans were arranged for his body. It was going to be electrified. An experiment was arranged to be performed by philosopher Giovanni Aldini, the nephew of Luigi Galvani, who discovered animal electricity, which is the act of jolting animals with electricity to make them move. It is stated that on the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. According to legend, one observer of this event was so alarmed that he died of fright a couple hours after returning home. This experiment is thought to be a possible influence on Frankenstein, the first appearance of sci-fi, but it will be nearly 4 decades before the genre is recognized. In the second half of the 19th century, 2 important writers made their mark on the sci-fi genre: Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, both men that are now considered to be the fathers of sci-fi. Jules Verne published one of his most influential stories, From the Earth to the Moon, in 1865. The story describes the creation of a powerful gun large enough to shoot a capsule of people to the moon. As the story goes, they did succeed and shot 3 people to the moon. This story, written by Jules Verne, follows very closely to the 3 men in the Apollo 11 mission to the moon in 1969. In his research for the book, Jules Verne did rough calculations on what it would take to shoot a capsule to the moon. He was surprisingly close, within 4% of the precise calculations known today. It was now nearing the turn of the century, and H.G. Wells published arguably the most influential story in the sci-fi genre, War of the Worlds. The story depicts Martians coming to Earth with massive machines that shoot lasers hotter than the sun. War of the Worlds inspired many, but it made a special impact on the father of modern rocketry, Robert H. Goddard, who first patented the liquid-fueled rocket in 1914. Every year on October 19th, Goddard celebrated the day he first came up with the idea of a rocket, which happened to be while pruning a cherry tree. Remembering the event, he stated, "I was a different boy when I descended the tree from when I ascended. Existence at last seemed very purposive." In a letter he wrote in 1932, Goddard attributes most of his inspiration to H.G. Wells. He said, "In 1998, I read your War of the Worlds. I was 16 years old, and the new viewpoints of scientific applications as well as the compelling realism made a deep impression." By the beginning of the 20th century, sci-fi was getting its first film. Released in 1902, A Trip to the Moon, directed by George Méliès. The movie was heavily inspired by H.G. Wells' First Men in the Moon and Jules Verne From the Earth to the Moon. The 1930s was an all-time high for the radio, and nearly 60% of all U.S. households owned one. It was common for people to gather around the radio together and enjoy their favorite program. Millions of people tuned in every evening. It was their trusted source for news, music, and entertainment. But on the eve of Halloween 1938, people heard something that sent shivers down their spine. Orson Welles, a very successful actor and director inspired by the works of the sci-fi genre, thought to turn one of those works into a reality. During the Halloween special of a 13-week radio series hosted by Orson Welles titled Mercury Theater on the Air, Orson Welles had the unique idea of enacting the events of War of the Worlds as if they were happening in real time. "I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening," he said, "and would be broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be the real event taking place at that time. rather than a mere radio play. Wells and his team worked tirelessly to convert the novel into fake news bulletins describing the Martian invasion. They did an incredible job. Almost too good.
Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Although the beginning of the broadcast disclosed it was fictional, it sent a wave of mass hysteria over thousands. The program aired on CBS, a station with a much smaller audience as compared to NBC, which was broadcasting a famous ventriloquist at the time. It is thought that when NBC ended their event, people tuned in halfway through the CBS broadcast they had no knowledge was fake. Hundreds of people called their local police stations, newspapers, and radio stations with their concerns, asking what they should do to prepare. After the broadcast concluded, the studio was filled with police officers who were very concerned about the distress the broadcast had caused, and by the next morning, Orson Welles was at the top of every headline. That same day, Welles was called into a press conference where he gave an apology.
It came rather as a great surprise to us that a story, the fine H.G. Wells classic fantasy, the original for so many succeeding comic strips and adventure stories and novels, about a mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
His apology, however, left many people unconvinced. They did not believe the apology was sincere, and many thought the press over-dramatized the public reaction to the broadcast. But whether or not these claims are true, Orson Welles turned people's eyes to the stars. 1938 was the start of the golden age for sci-fi, which couldn't have started without the influence of John W. Campbell, who was one of the most famous and highly regarded authors of science fiction. He wrote several successful sci-fi stories while working for both Amazing and Astounding magazine, and in 1938 he wrote Who Goes There?, the novel behind the making of the movie The Thing. That same year he became the editor of the Astounding magazine, which was the largest science fiction magazine at the time. Being editor allowed Campbell to shape the future of modern sci-fi by only allowing stories that aligned with his vision of the genre. One day, while working in his office, Campbell heard a knock at the door. It was Isaac Asimov, a young man with a dream of writing for the Astounding magazine. Asimov was there attempting to publish his first story, but it wasn't going to be easy because Campbell was a man of high standards. He was described as an opinionated man who smoked and talked constantly, and who enjoyed above anything else the production of outrageous ideas, which he bounced off his listener and dared him to refute. After a long debate, Campbell rejected Asimov's story, but encouraged him to keep trying. And so, Asimov sent in a story a month for almost a year until Campbell finally accepted and made him one of the writers for the magazine. This was the start of a friendship that would last for decades. Sci-fi would go on to impact countless different areas of our world, especially in the field of technology. It has influenced communication, entertainment, space travel, transportation, and even the pacemaker, which was inspired by Frankenstein. It is also arguable that because sci-fi influenced the invention of the rocket, humans may have not gone to the moon, or even considered it a possibility. Sci-fi also gives a way for people to express their concerns about the future. A great example of this is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was written in 1968 by Arthur C. Clarke. It describes a fascinating journey through space which a rogue AI, HAL 9000, takes control of the ship. The concerns Clarke raises when describing AI closely align with the topic of discussion today. Without the imagination of its founding authors, we would have a limited view of the future. Science fiction altered our reality and continues to bridge the gap between what is imaginable and what is possible in science and technology.
The scientist is always inhibited somewhat when it comes to speculation. He can't, or at least he feels he can't, put himself in a position where he seems to be going beyond that which cold logic and the evidence makes reasonable. The science fiction writer, on the other hand, can leap across chasms where no evidence has yet filled in matters,